Bullies punched the nerd in the stomach. They didn't know he was a Wushu master. Ethan Rodriguez pushed his thick glasses up his nose as he shuffled through the crowded hallways of Lincoln High School, his oversized backpack weighing him down like an anchor. At 16, he was painfully thin, all sharp elbows and knobby knees, with messy black hair that never seemed to cooperate no matter how much gel he used. His clothes hung loose on his frame, hand-me-downs from his older brother that made him look even smaller than he already was. It had been 2 months since his family moved to this sprawling suburban school outside Chicago, and Ethan still felt like a ghost drifting through corridors filled with confident teenagers who seemed to have figured out the secret code of high school social dynamics. His thick accent, a remnant of his childhood in a small New Mexico town, made him stand out in ways he desperately wished he didn't. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lincoln High, casting long shadows across the polished floors as students rushed to their first period classes. Ethan kept his head down, clutching his chemistry textbook against his chest like a shield, hoping to make it to his locker without incident. "Hey, Four Eyes!" The voice cut through the morning chatter like a knife. Ethan's stomach dropped as he recognized the speaker. Brett Collins was everything Ethan wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being a star player on the football team. His perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive clothes marked him as one of Lincoln High's social elite, someone who had never experienced a moment of self-doubt in his life. Behind Brett stood his usual crew: Mason Wright, a stocky kid with mean eyes and scarred knuckles, and Connor Davis, whose permanent smirk suggested he found cruelty amusing. They were all seniors, all athletes, all accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and social pressure. "I'm talking to you, Rodriguez," Brett called out, his voice carrying across the hallway. Ethan stopped walking and turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" Brett laughed, the sound echoing off the metal lockers. "I want to know why you think you can just walk around here like you belong." The hallway was beginning to empty as students hurried to beat the first bell, but those who remained had slowed their pace, sensing the familiar tension that preceded a confrontation. Ethan noticed their faces, curious, uncomfortable, but ultimately indifferent to his plight. "I'm just trying to get to class," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of slamming lockers and distant conversations. Mason stepped closer, his bulk blocking Ethan's path to his locker. "You're just trying to get to class," he repeated mockingly. "Did you hear that, guys? The little nerd's just trying to get to class." Connor snickered. "Maybe he needs help finding his way. You know how confusing high school can be for someone with such a big brain." Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his voice steady. "Can you please just let me pass?" Brett's expression shifted, his mock-friendly demeanor dissolving into something colder. "Please let me pass," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "God, you're pathetic. No wonder you don't have any friends." The observation stung because it was true. In the 2 months since arriving at Lincoln High, Ethan had made exactly 0 friends. He ate lunch alone in the library, sat by himself in classes, and spent his free periods studying in empty classrooms. Part of it was his natural introversion, but a larger part was the deliberate social isolation that came with being marked as different. "Look at him," Mason said, circling Ethan like a predator studying prey. "Bet he's never even talked to a girl. Bet he goes home every day and cries into his pillow." "I don't cry," Ethan said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Brett raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he speaks. And he's got some attitude too. I like that. Makes it more interesting." The first bell rang, and the hallway rapidly emptied as students rushed to their classrooms. Within seconds, Ethan found himself alone with his tormentors, the morning light casting their shadows across the floor like dark omens. "Here's the thing, Rodriguez," Brett said, stepping closer until Ethan could smell his expensive cologne. "This is our school. We've been here for 4 years. We know everyone. Everyone knows us. You're just some random kid who showed up and thinks he can ignore us." "I'm not ignoring anyone," Ethan protested. "I just mind my own business." "That's the problem," Connor said. "Your business is being a weird little freak who makes everyone uncomfortable. Walking around with your nose in a book, sitting alone like you're too good for everyone else." Ethan blinked in confusion. "I've never acted like I'm too good for anyone." "Sure you haven't," Mason said sarcastically. "Then prove it. Show us you're not just another stuck-up nerd who thinks he's better than us." "How?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Brett's smile was cold and calculated. "Meet us in the old gymnasium after school. The one they don't use anymore, behind the maintenance building. We're going to have a little educational session." Ethan's mouth went dry. The old gymnasium was notorious among Lincoln High students as a place where conflicts were settled away from teacher supervision. It was where feuds were resolved, scores were settled, and reputations were made or destroyed. "I don't want any trouble," Ethan said. "Too late for that," Mason laughed. "You should have thought about that before you started acting like you're special." "I never acted like I'm special," Ethan insisted. "I just want to be left alone." Connor stepped forward, his face inches from Ethan's. "Well, you can't be left alone, not anymore. Either you show up at the old gym after school, or we'll find you somewhere else. Your choice." The second bell rang, and the hallway fell completely silent, except for the distant sound of teachers beginning their lessons. Ethan was now officially late for first period chemistry, but that seemed like the least of his problems. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll be there." Brett's grin widened. "Smart choice, Rodriguez. See you at 3:30. The three seniors walked away laughing, their voices fading as they disappeared around the corner toward their own classes. Ethan stood alone in the empty hallway, his hands trembling slightly as he processed what had just happened. What Brett Collins and his friends didn't know, what nobody at Lincoln High knew, was that Ethan Rodriguez had been studying Wushu for the past 7 years. Every day after school at his old town, he had trained at Master Chen's academy, learning the ancient Chinese martial art that combined fluid movements with devastating strikes. His slight frame and bookish appearance had made him an unlikely martial artist, but Master Chen had seen something in him that others missed. "Size and strength are illusions," the old master had often said. "True power comes from precision, timing, and the ability to use an opponent's force against them." Ethan had competed in regional tournaments, earning medals and recognition for his technical skill and lightning-fast reflexes. But more importantly, Master Chen had taught him philosophy along with technique, the importance of avoiding conflict when possible, using violence only as a last resort, and never allowing skill to breed arrogance. "The greatest warrior is one who never has to fight," Master Chen had said during their final lesson before Ethan's family moved to Chicago. "But when fighting becomes necessary, you must be prepared to defend yourself and others." Now, as Ethan hurried toward his chemistry class, he found himself facing the exact situation Master Chen had prepared him for. He'd spent 2 months trying to avoid conflict, hoping to blend into the background and focus on his studies. But Brett Collins had made it clear that invisibility was no longer an option. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of equations and literary analysis, but Ethan's mind kept returning to the confrontation awaiting him. He'd hoped that changing schools might mean a fresh start, a chance to reinvent himself as someone confident and socially adept. Instead, he'd apparently triggered some primal instinct in the school's alpha predators simply by existing. During third period English, he noticed Brett Collins sitting across the room, occasionally glancing in his direction with that same predatory smile. The older boy seemed to be enjoying the psychological pressure, savoring the anticipation of what was to come. "Mr. Rodriguez," came the voice of Mrs. Anderson, the English teacher. "Could you please read the next passage from Hamlet?" Ethan nodded and found his place in the text, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. As he read Prince Hamlet's famous soliloquy about action and inaction, he couldn't help but see the parallels to his own situation. "To be or not to be, that is the question," he read aloud. "Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them." Brett Collins snorted softly, and several students turned to look at him. Mrs. Anderson frowned but didn't comment, allowing Ethan to continue reading. The irony wasn't lost on him. Like Hamlet, he was faced with a choice between passive suffering and active resistance. Unlike Shakespeare's prince, however, Ethan possessed the physical skills to back up any decision he might make. Lunch period arrived with its usual chaos of crowded cafeterias and social hierarchies, but Ethan retreated to his familiar sanctuary in the library. He found his usual spot in the back corner, surrounded by dusty volumes of poetry and philosophy, and tried to lose himself in advanced calculus problems, but concentration proved impossible. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing at the clock, watching the minutes tick by toward his 3:30 appointment with Brett Collins and his crew. His stomach churned with a mixture of anxiety and something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. "Ethan," came a soft voice from nearby. He looked up to see Rachel Kim, a quiet sophomore from his chemistry class, approaching his table with obvious nervousness. She was small and delicate, with straight black hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that were even thicker than his own. "Hi, Rachel," he said, closing his calculus textbook. "I heard what happened this morning," she said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "With Brett Collins and his friends." Ethan felt his cheeks flush. Word travels fast. "Are you okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Those guys they're not good people. They've made life miserable for a lot of students here." "I'll be fine," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Rachel sat down across from him, her expression serious. "Brett Collins put a kid in the hospital last year. Jimmy Martinez. He was a freshman who supposedly disrespected one of Brett's friends. They found him in the old gymnasium with a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs. Ethan's blood ran cold. What happened to Brett?" "Nothing," Rachel said bitterly. "His dad's a lawyer, the family has money, and Jimmy was too scared to press charges. The school administration claimed they couldn't prove anything without witnesses. Did you see it happen?" "No, but everyone knew. That's how it works here. Brett and his friends do whatever they want, and everyone else just tries to stay out of their way." Ethan absorbed this information, feeling the weight of his situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He'd been hoping for a simple confrontation, maybe some pushing and shoving that would establish boundaries and end the harassment. But if Rachel was right, Brett Collins was capable of real violence. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Rachel's cheeks reddened slightly. "Because you seem like a good person. You help people with homework, you don't gossip or spread rumors, and you've never been mean to anyone. You don't deserve what they're planning to do to you." "What are they planning to do to me?" "I don't know specifically," she admitted, "but whatever it is, you should tell a teacher or the principal. Don't try to handle this alone." Ethan considered her advice. He could report the threats to the administration, but based on what Rachel had told him about Jimmy Martinez, he doubted they would take effective action. Brett Collins was a star athlete from a wealthy family, the kind of student that schools protected rather than punished. "Thanks for the warning," he said finally. "I'll figure something out." Rachel looked like she wanted to say more, but the lunch bell rang, and students began filtering out of the library toward their afternoon classes. She gathered her books and stood up, then paused. "Ethan, whatever happens, please be careful. I'd hate to see you get hurt." As she walked away, Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was the first time since arriving at Lincoln High that anyone had expressed genuine concern for his welfare. The feeling was both comforting and motivating. Someone cared what happened to him, which meant he had a responsibility to handle this situation properly. The afternoon classes passed even more slowly than the morning ones. During physics, Mr. Thompson discussed Newton's laws of motion, and Ethan found himself thinking about the practical applications of force and momentum in combat situations. In history, Ms. Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared surname, lectured about the American Revolution, and Ethan contemplated the parallels between standing up to tyranny and standing up to bullies. By the time the final bell rang at 3:15, Ethan had made his decision. He would go to the old gymnasium, not because he wanted to fight, but because running away would only make the situation worse. Brett Collins and his friends needed to understand that he wasn't an easy target, that there were consequences for their actions. He walked to his locker, deposited his afternoon textbooks, and retrieved a small leather journal that contained notes from his years of martial arts training. Inside were diagrams of pressure points, descriptions of joint locks and throws, and philosophical observations about the nature of combat and self-defense. On the final page, written in Master Chen's careful handwriting, was a single sentence. The wise warrior avoids the battle, but when battle comes, he fights with purpose. Ethan closed the journal and walked toward the back of the school, where the old gymnasium waited like a colosseum from ancient Rome. The building was smaller and more run down than the main gym, with cracked windows and peeling paint that spoke of years of neglect. He pushed through the heavy metal doors and found Brett Collins, Mason Wright, and Connor Davis waiting in the center of the basketball court. The space was dimly lit by dusty skylights, and their voices echoed off the concrete walls. "Look who showed up," Brett said, his tone suggesting mild surprise. "Wasn't sure you had the guts, Rodriguez." Ethan walked to the middle of the gym, his sneakers squeaking on the worn hardwood floor. "I said I'd be here." Mason cracked his knuckles theatrically. "Yeah, you did. Question is, are you ready for what comes next?" "What comes next?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew. Connor grinned. "What comes next is you learning some respect. See, we've been talking, and we decided that you need a lesson in how things work around here." "I already know how things work," Ethan said quietly. "You pick on people who can't fight back because it makes you feel powerful." Brett's smile faded. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. "You're bullies. You target kids who are smaller or different because deep down you're insecure and you need to feel superior to someone." Mason stepped forward, his face flushing red. "You little piece of—" "Let him talk," Brett interrupted, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "I want to hear what the genius has to say." Ethan took a deep breath, drawing on the meditation techniques Master Chen had taught him. "I think you're scared. I think you see someone who's different, someone who doesn't fit your idea of what a high school student should be, and it threatens you. So you try to destroy what you don't understand." "You think you understand us?" Connor laughed. "You don't know anything about us." "I know enough," Ethan replied. "I know that you've been picking on younger students for years. I know that you put Jimmy Martinez in the hospital. I know that you think violence solves problems." Brett's expression darkened. "Jimmy Martinez was an accident. Kid fell down some stairs." "Sure he did," Ethan said sarcastically. "Just like I'm sure whatever happens to me here will be an accident too." "You're damn right it will be," Mason snarled, taking another step forward, "and there won't be any witnesses to say otherwise." Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but his breathing remained steady. This was the moment Master Chen had prepared him for, the moment when talking stopped and action became necessary. "Last chance, Rodriguez," Brett said. "Get on your knees, apologize for being a disrespectful little freak, and maybe we'll go easy on you." "No," Ethan said simply. No? Brett's eyebrows rose. No what? No, I won't get on my knees. No, I won't apologize for being myself. And no, I won't let you intimidate me anymore. Connor laughed. Listen to him. He thinks he's some kind of tough guy now. I don't think I'm tough, Ethan said. I think I'm tired of being afraid. Brett nodded slowly. Fair enough. Mason, show him what happens to kids who don't know their place. Mason stepped forward with obvious relish, his scarred knuckles already clenched into fists. He was bigger than Ethan by at least 50 pounds, with the kind of bulk that came from hours in the weight room, and his eyes held the cold gleam of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. This is going to hurt, Mason said, drawing back his right fist. The punch came fast and hard, aimed directly at Ethan's stomach with enough force to double him over and leave him gasping on the floor. In the split second before impact, Ethan felt time slow down in the way Master Chen had taught him to recognize. His body shifted slightly to the left, Mason's fist glancing off his ribs instead of landing squarely in his solar plexus. At the same moment, Ethan stepped forward and trapped Mason's extended arm against his body, using a classic Wushu technique called Embrace Tiger, Return to Mountain. His left hand came up in a controlled strike to Mason's throat, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to make the bigger boy gag and stumble backward. Before Mason could recover, Ethan pivoted and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the gymnasium floor. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Brett and Connor stared in shock, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Mason rolled on the floor, gasping and holding his throat, his face turning purple as he struggled to breathe. "What the hell?" Connor started to say, then rushed forward with his own wild haymaker. Ethan sidestepped smoothly, his movements flowing like water around stone. He caught Connor's wrist as the punch sailed past, twisted sharply to hyperextend the joint, and used the momentum to throw Connor into the concrete wall. The impact echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. Brett stood frozen, his confident demeanor completely shattered as he watched his two friends struggle to recover from their injuries. Mason was still gasping for air, and Connor was slumped against the wall with a dazed expression on his face. "How?" Brett whispered. "How did you? What are you?" Ethan straightened his glasses, which had somehow remained in place throughout the confrontation. "I'm someone who's been studying Wushu for 7 years. I've trained 6 days a week, 4 hours a day since I was 9 years old. I've competed in national tournaments and sparred with grown men who could break concrete blocks with their bare hands." "You're lying," Brett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why would I lie about something you just witnessed?" Ethan asked. "I never wanted to use these skills on other students. My master taught me that martial arts should only be used to protect yourself or others, never to start fights." Mason finally managed to sit up, his breathing still labored. "If you're some kind of kung fu master or whatever, why didn't you fight back before?" "Because I hoped you'd leave me alone," Ethan said honestly. "Because I didn't want to hurt anyone. Because I was raised to believe that violence should always be a last resort." Brett looked around the gymnasium, taking in the sight of his defeated friends and the quiet confidence radiating from the kid he'd dismissed as an easy target. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice shook slightly. "Yes, it does," Ethan replied. "It changes everything. You can't intimidate me anymore because you know I can defend myself. You can't hurt me without consequences because I've proven I'm not helpless." Connor struggled to his feet, cradling his injured wrist. "You think this is over? We'll get you back for this." Ethan shook his head. "No, you won't, because if you try, I'll make sure everyone in school knows exactly what happened here. I'll tell them how 3 seniors tried to beat up 1 junior and got taken apart in less than 10 seconds. The threat hit home. Brett's reputation as a tough guy was built on his ability to intimidate others, and having that reputation destroyed by a skinny nerd would be social suicide. Besides, Ethan continued, I have friends now. People who care what happens to me. If I disappear or get hurt under mysterious circumstances, they'll know exactly who to blame. It was a bluff. Rachel Kim was hardly enough of a support network to deter serious retaliation. But Brett didn't know that. The uncertainty was enough to give him pause. Mason finally stood up, still rubbing his throat. Come on, guys. This place smells like failure anyway. The three boys walked toward the exit, their earlier confidence replaced by embarrassment and confusion. As they reached the doors, Brett turned back one final time. This isn't over, Rodriguez. Yes, Ethan said quietly. It is. After they left, Ethan stood alone in the old gymnasium, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of combat. He'd solved his immediate problem, but he knew the real work was just beginning. Word of what had happened would spread throughout Lincoln High, and his life would never be the same. He thought about Master Chen's teachings on the responsibility that came with power. With great skill comes great obligation, the old man had said. Those who can protect others must decide whether they will. For years, Ethan had avoided that decision, content to train in private and keep his abilities secret. But Brett Collins had forced his hand, and now he faced a choice that would define his remaining years in high school. As he walked out of the gymnasium and into the afternoon sunlight, Ethan felt a profound shift in his understanding of himself. He was no longer the invisible new kid who tried to blend into the background. But he wasn't a bully or a vigilante either. He was simply Ethan Rodriguez, a student, a martial artist, and someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to find peace was to be prepared for war. The next morning arrived with the usual chaos of alarm clocks and hurried breakfast routines. But Ethan approached Lincoln High School with a confidence he'd never felt before. As he walked through the front doors, he noticed something different in how other students looked at him. Not with the dismissive indifference he'd grown accustomed to, but with something approaching respect. Word had indeed traveled fast. By the end of first period, it seemed like everyone in school had heard some version of what had happened in the old gymnasium. The details had grown in the telling. Some students claimed he'd fought off 6 attackers. Others insisted he'd used ancient ninja techniques, but the core truth remained. The quiet nerd had taken down Brett Collins's crew. During chemistry class, Rachel Kim approached his lab station with obvious excitement. Is it true? Did you really beat up Brett Collins and his friends? Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks. I defended myself. That's all. That's all, she laughed. Ethan, nobody has ever stood up to those guys. They've been terrorizing students for years. Other classmates began to gather around, their questions coming in rapid succession. Where did you learn to fight like that? Could you teach me some moves? Are you going to try out for the wrestling team? Ethan raised his hands, asking for quiet. Look, I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to be left alone. Brett and his friends wouldn't let that happen, so I defended myself. But how? Asked Tommy Walsh, a freshman who'd been stuffed in a locker by Mason Wright just the week before. You're like half their size. Size doesn't matter if you know what you're doing, Ethan said. I've been studying martial arts for most of my life, but I never wanted to use it on other students. Well, I'm glad you did, said Jennifer Martinez, Jimmy's older sister. Maybe now they'll think twice before picking on people who can't fight back. As the crowd dispersed and class began, Ethan reflected on the unexpected consequences of his actions. He'd solved his personal bullying problem, but in doing so, he'd apparently become a symbol of resistance for other students who'd suffered under Brett Collins's reign of terror. The pattern continued throughout the day. Students who'd never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to be his friend. Teachers looked at him with new interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Even the principal, Mr. Davidson, pulled him aside between classes to ask if everything was all right. But the most significant change was in how Brett Collins and his friends behaved. When Ethan passed them in the hallway, they looked away and found sudden interest in their locker combinations. During lunch, they sat at their usual table, but spoke in hushed tones, their earlier swagger completely gone. The transformation wasn't limited to the original antagonists. Other students who'd been picking on underclassmen suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. The entire social ecosystem of Lincoln High seemed to be recalibrating itself around the new reality that actions had consequences. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the old gymnasium, Ethan was studying in the library when Brett Collins approached his table. The encounter was unexpected. Brett had been carefully avoiding him since their fight, and Ethan immediately tensed. But Brett's posture was different now. His shoulders were slumped, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Rodriguez," Brett said quietly. "Can I sit down?" Ethan gestured to the empty chair across from him. "What do you want?" Brett sat down heavily, his hands fidgeting with a worn paperback novel. "I wanted to apologize for what I did to you, for how I treated you." The apology was so unexpected that Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. "Okay," he said finally. "I know sorry doesn't fix anything," Brett continued. "I know I made your life hell for no good reason. I was dealing with some stuff at home, and I took it out on you because you seemed like an easy target." Ethan studied Brett's face, looking for signs of deception, but the older boy seemed genuinely remorseful, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like shame. "What kind of stuff at home?" Ethan asked. Brett's jaw tightened. "My dad. He expects a lot from me. Perfect grades, perfect athletic performance, perfect behavior. When I fall short, he lets me know about it, usually with his fists." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd assumed Brett's cruelty came from a place of privilege and entitlement. But the truth was more complex. The bully was also a victim, trapped in a cycle of abuse that he'd perpetuated by targeting those weaker than himself. "That doesn't excuse what you did," Ethan said carefully. "No, it doesn't," Brett agreed. "But it explains it. When you're getting beaten down at home, it feels good to have power over someone else at school. It makes you feel less helpless." Ethan considered this perspective. Master Chen had taught him that understanding an opponent's motivations was as important as understanding their techniques. "Is that why you picked on me specifically?" Brett nodded. "You were new, you were different, and you didn't fight back. Plus, you're obviously smarter than me, which made me feel even more insecure." "Intelligence isn't a competition," Ethan said. "We're all good at different things." "Maybe," Brett replied. "But when your dad constantly reminds you that you're not living up to your potential, it's hard not to resent people who seem to have it all figured out." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them like a bridge across hostile territory. "What you did in that gym," Brett said finally, "it wasn't just about defending yourself. It was about showing me that I'm not as tough as I thought I was, that there are consequences for treating people badly." "That's exactly what it was about," Ethan confirmed. "Well," Brett said, extending his hand across the table, "message received. I won't bother you again, and I'll make sure Mason and Connor leave you alone too." Ethan looked at the offered hand for a moment, then shook it. "What about the other students you've been picking on?" Brett's face flushed. "I'm working on that too, making amends, you know. It's harder than I thought it would be." "Change usually is," Ethan said, "but it's worth it." As Brett walked away, Ethan felt a sense of completion that he hadn't expected. The situation had resolved not with continued hostility or awkward avoidance, but with something approaching mutual understanding and respect. That evening, as Ethan practiced his forms in the converted garage that served as his training space, he reflected on the lessons of the past month. He'd learned that sometimes avoiding conflict was impossible, that standing up for yourself could have positive effects you never anticipated, and that even bullies were capable of growth and change. Most importantly, he'd learned that Master Chen's teachings about the responsibility that came with power weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were practical guidelines for navigating real-world situations where his skills could make a difference. As he completed his final form, a complex sequence of strikes and blocks that flowed together like a deadly dance, Ethan smiled slightly. He was no longer the invisible new kid who tried to avoid attention at all costs. But he wasn't a vigilante or a bully either. He was simply Ethan Rodriguez, a student, a martial artist, and someone who had learned to stand up for himself while maintaining his principles. The transformation wasn't complete. High school social dynamics were too complex to be solved by a single confrontation, but something fundamental had shifted. Ethan had found his place not by trying to be invisible, but by being authentically himself, even when that authenticity required courage. And sometimes, he reflected as he bowed to finish his practice session, that courage was the most important lesson of all. The skinny nerd with thick glasses had become someone who commanded respect, not through fear or intimidation, but through the quiet confidence that came from knowing he could protect himself and others when necessary. In a world where bullies preyed on the weak, he had chosen to be strong, not just physically, but morally and emotionally as well.